Hi, I am Professor Casado-Pérez, and I am going to give you a taste of what we cover in property law. I'm going to cover part of our discussion on adverse possession. In this video, I will be doing a lot of lecturing. If we were in the classroom, I will be talking much less, and I would expect you to interact with me and discuss a lot of the items and a lot of the cases that I'm going to briefly mention today. What is adverse possession? Adverse possession is making owner someone who wasn't. And that feels a little bit weird, right? We normally think about protecting property rights. And here I am trying to explain an institution that it's gonna make owner someone who has been using either real estate or a personal property item, think painting, during a period of time. And I'm mostly going to focus on real estate. At the end, I will briefly mention what are the differences with personal property. Think about what are the legal foundations of adverse possession. When I enter on someone else's land, I am a trespasser. The owner of that piece of land has an action, can file an action against me for trespass. And it has a period of time during which it can file the action. 5, 7, 10 years. It will depend on the particular jurisdiction. If he does nothing during that period and I have entered that land and I have been using it, at the end of that period, I may have, if I fulfill the elements that we are going to talk next, adverse possess the land. And I could file a declaratory action to quiet the title and to tell the judge to say, from now on, you are the owner of this piece of land. Why do we have adverse possession? It's important to think about the reasons behind a legal institution to really understand why the different elements or requirements of adverse possession are there. There are 3 reasons why we have adverse possession. The first one is we don't like owners that sit on their rights, that sleep and don't exercise their actions. We like titles to reflect reality. And when we have someone using the land and an absentee owner, that's not happening. The second is we want land to be productive. We want property to actually produce. If an owner is not using a piece of property and someone else is, that someone else is the one who is contributing to making it productive. And the third reason is this idea that when you live somewhere or when you use something, it kind of it's part of your personhood, right? That you build this relationship with a piece of land that you are cultivating and the like. So we are trying to protect that. So understanding these 3 reasons, the idea that we don't want titles to don't reflect reality and owners that slept on their rights, that we want property to be productive, and that we want to protect those that have an attachment to the property. Let's think about the different elements. And for that, I'm gonna share my screen so that I can show you the list of elements. Okay. So the list is long. Adverse possession has to be actual, it has to be exclusive, open and notorious, adverse and hostile, continuous for the statutory period, and in some states, you can only adverse possess if you have been paying the property taxes on that property. So let's walk through these different elements. Adverse possession has to be actual. What does that mean? That you have to physically possess the property. You have to be in the property. Does that mean you have to be 24 hours a day, all day long? No, imagine that you are adverse possessing a vacation home. Nobody will expect you to be there all the time. You have to make use of that piece of property as the owner would. There is one qualification here. Some people adverse possess a piece of property and they have some sort of title to that property, a mistaken title, but their adverse possession is based on a deed. When that's the case, that's called adverse possessing under the color of title. And in those cases, there are some extra benefits for that adverse possessor. Some jurisdictions shorten the statutory period for being a trespass action, so you can adverse possess in a shorter period of time. In others, you get some constructive possession of sorts. So imagine the following. There is a 100-acre piece of land, and I am an adverse possessor, and I enter that piece of land, but I only occupy 40. I am only cultivating corn in 40 of the 100 acres. Without color of title, I would only be entitled to those 40 acres. If instead I had a deed that said, you, Vanessa, are the owner of the 100 acres, and even if that deed is mistaken, but I am basing my adverse possession on that, but I am only possessing 40, I will still be entitled to the 100. The adverse possession has to be actual and exclusive. What does exclusive mean? I have to adverse possess by myself, not now I possess for 1 year, then I leave and someone else comes in and then they kind of benefit from the year I adverse possess. Every time someone adverse possess, the clock starts over, with some exception, as we will see when we deal with continuous. But it also means that I can adverse possess with my family. So if all of us suddenly move to a piece of property that it's not ours, that's fine. That doesn't affect exclusivity. But this is mostly to deal with situations like a squatter, someone who lives a couple of days in a house, goes somewhere else, and then someone comes in and there is no relationship between them. The adverse possession has to be actual, exclusive, and open and notorious. Open and notorious means that if someone was adverse possessing my house, by driving by, I should be able that the house is occupied, right? That there is nothing non-transparent about the possession. So to give you some illustration of what this may look like in a case, there was this case Marengo where there were two neighbors, and one of them started making a business out of showing a cave, and the entry of the cave was under his property. But it turns out that the cave was under both properties. The second neighbor didn't know. And at some point he realizes that the cave that he's charging fees to visit, it's not only under the neighbor's property, but also her own property. And then sues the neighbor saying, hey, you have been using my property. And the neighbor says, no, I have adverse possess it because I have been using it for such a long period of time. And the court sided with the plaintiff, arguing that he had no way to know that there was something going on, in part of his property he couldn't see because it was underground. It has to be actual, exclusive, open and notorious, and adverse and hostile. That means that you have to be adverse to the owner. But here jurisdictions take very different approaches. So there are mostly three. The first one is the good faith approach. So you have to think that you are the owner of that piece of property that you are possessing. You should not know that it belongs to someone else. Other jurisdictions take a completely opposite approach. You have to know that this piece of property belongs to someone else and that you are adverse possessing it, that you are hostile to that owner. And the third set of jurisdictions couldn't care less about the state of mind of the adverse possessor and just look at whether that adverse possessor has been acting as an owner, which is a much easier to administer standard than the other two. So actual, exclusive, open and notorious, adverse and hostile, and continuous. That means that you have to possess the property for the whole statutory period. For if it's 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever is the amount of time that the particular jurisdiction requires. There is one exception. In some cases, if the adverse possessor transfers the property to someone else, be via will or via a contract, that other person may tack on the adverse possession of the first person because they have a privity relationship. Privity is a complex concept that you will encounter in several times in property and in other law school courses, but it just means that there is some sort of documented relationship between the two parties in transferring that property for the purposes of this explanation. So imagine that I am adverse possessing this house, and I have a will and I leave my property to my daughter, and particularly this house. So whenever I have started adverse possessing today, I die 2 years later, my daughter could actually benefit from these 2 years. And if the statute of limitation was 10, he only had to adverse possess for 8 more. That's called tacking. And it has to be for the statutory period. That means the number of years that the jurisdiction requires. There is only one thing that stops the clock, and are disabilities. And for those, you have to read the statute of the particular jurisdiction very carefully, because the causes or the disabilities are enumerated. Normally includes minority, being in prison, perhaps being in the military, but you have to really look at the situations. And the disabilities that stop the clock have to exist at the time of the adverse possession starts. What does that mean? There is an owner who is a minor. Then and that minor is the property owner of this house. Someone comes and starts adverse possessing this house. The owner is not here. This minor who owns the house is not here. The person who is adverse possessing, the statutory period has not started to run. It will start to run when the owner, who is a minor, because that's one of the disabilities, reaches his or her majority. But the disability has to exist the moment the adverse possession starts. So let me give you another hypothetical. Imagine that I own this house, but I am nowhere to be seen. Someone comes in and starts adverse possessing the house. 2 years later, I am in prison. That disability will never count. So the clock had started ticking the moment that the adverse possessor entered this house and start possessing and acting like an owner of this house, because at that point, I didn't have any disability. The fact that I was in prison 2 years after doesn't affect. And just to close this mini lecture, think about the difference between real property and personal property. Adverse possession looks similar in both, but think about what happens if you have a piece of art and somewhat it disappears and someone else gets it. That someone else will put it in their living room. It's much more difficult to know who has it than a house, right? If I drive by this house, I will see that it's occupied, but I don't know which pieces of art they have inside. And they may be adverse possessing some of those. So that's why courts have had to twist a little bit some of these requirements. And basically what they have been asking of the property owner who has lost a piece of property that someone else is adverse possessing is to be diligent, to actually take steps to recover the property, not to just sit and wait. Right? So imagine that a piece of art is stolen. There is a registry of stolen pieces of art where you could go and make sure that they know that you have that piece of art. Or you should use channels that are, that can give evidence that you are trying to recover that property. And with that, I'm just gonna leave you with my email address so that you should feel free, so that you have it, and you can feel free to email me with questions about adverse possession or any other thing that you want to chat about the law school and so on.